We'll be going live in a sec.
Sure.
Standing at the border, standing at the edge, and claiming that it is the work of Black and African women all over the world. All our projects are personal and political. If we don't theorize ourselves and our experiences, we will always be understood through someone else's good lenses. This is what is written on Londiwe Mtambo's paper. My name is Isasipingosi Mdingi, your host here at the Young Researchers Hub, where science and the public becomes one. Today, we're having a privilege of having a conversation with Londiwe. Londiwe is the strategist and content creator for Iliwa Consultancy. She is an African feminist thinker who specializes on feminist theory, African girlhood and womanhood, and security studies. She holds a master's degree from the Department of Political and International Studies from Rhodes University. Her thesis titled Umemulo and Zulugirlhood, ukuziphatha kahle, good behavior, and sexual rights in post-apartheid South Africa, seeks to expand understandings of the ways in which girlhood and womanhood are experienced post-apartheid South Africa. Londiwe also worked in civic society as project manager at the Friedrich Ebert Foundation, focusing on democracy and civic participation. In this role, she focuses on political education, stakeholder engagements, as well as policy reform and advocacy. Londiwe is a member of the Commonwealth Youth Forum task force, tasked with delivering the CYF that will form part of the discussion and international policy making at the next Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting, which creates common policies that deal with some of the global issues. She has also been a panelist at several conferences and dialogues, including the African Feminisms Conference 2019, presenting a paper titled, All Your Faves Are Problematic, Understanding Feminism and Its Contradictions. Londiwe, thank you very much for joining us today here at the Young Researchers Hub, and we welcome you to our community here at the Young Researchers Hub. How are you today?
I'm well, Isa, I'm well. Thank you so much for the opportunity. Thank you so much for the invite. In this cold Joburg weather, we must still do the things of unpacking our work. So I'm happy to be here today and happy to be joining the fam.
Thank you very much. Sorry for the late start. It was a technical network glitch as we're trying to navigate this network with South Africa and everything else. We're still trying to navigate network issues, and I apologize for that from my side. Londi, we're gonna quickly jump into your study
Sure.
as you unpack your research. And the first time we had this conversation, me and you, I said to you, you know what, the whole conversation around virginity testing, umemulo and ukuziphatha kahle has been a conversation that now has become more difficult, or rather there's tension when the conversation is being unpacked because of different views that people have. And I mentioned that sometimes some of us come from a point of not really understanding as to what it means. And I'm glad today you're coming here to educate us as a public as to what is Umemulo, especially for people who are not born in KwaZulu or Eswazini, which is those are the two tribes that still practice that, with a bit of the Xhosa side where it's called Inceyo, which is I would understand that there's a bit of differences. But today we're visiting the Zululand and we want to learn more about the Zulu kingdom when it comes to Umemulo. May you please take us through your research background in terms of your study?
Okay, so I think a couple of things to mention. One, I really wanted to do this thesis from the lens of Zulu women, and like really centering the voices of Zulu women in the study. And I think that that's one of my biggest wins when it comes to the way that we've put together this thesis, so that I've put together this thesis, is that the voice of the Zulu women is very clear. What I also wanted us to do is to have a conversation that goes beyond. So often when we talk about womanhood or girlhood, we want to talk about and you even notice with the literature that exists, like we want to talk about illnesses and HIV, and we want to talk about precarity, right? And I'm not saying that precarity doesn't exist, but I'm saying, Aibo, what else is happening for us in the way that we engage our womanhood and that we engage our girlhood outside of that precarity? And I really wanted to question ukuthi bathini bona, the people who participate in this thing, right? And the people who still value this thing. I think also just to note that, so this study is born out of me having had my own Umemulo, right? It was 2 years now from 21. A couple of years ago, my own Umemulo, and I had to, so I was thinking throughout the process, and particularly after the process, I was thinking about what this process had actually meant for me, and whether or not this process had, because this process is about attaining womanhood, was I now this completely different person, or this woman from having been a girl? And so after asking myself those questions, and of course I'll unpack as I go into findings and discussions what brought about, you know, these questions, I was like, oh, I'm not sure that I'm this, you know, fundamentally different person. And so the study is born out of wanting to know about myself, wanting to know about my relationship with my mother, wanting to know about the ways in which Umemulo can be useful for me, izinto that we do through a culture. So when we talk about rituals and rites of practice, how are they still useful for me now as Ulondi? And so that's where the study is born out of. That's where the study is born out of. And I think just in terms of the major questions that I wanted to ask, is I wanted to ask, how have like conceptions of ukuziphatha kahle evolved, right? When we talk about ukuziphatha kahle, we talk about good behavior. How have these understandings or notions evolved through time? Because the way I understand ukuziphatha kahle and the way that another generation, an older generation, understands ukuziphatha kahle may not be the same. So I wanted to find out what is the evolution and what's causing that sort of evolution. And I think I'll unpack more on ukuziphatha kahle when I go deeper. But that is sort of the background of where the study comes from.
Okay. As I was reading through your thesis, I was beginning to understand as to what Umemulo is in terms of or what you explain, that it is a ritual done for Zulu girls, is like unpack that you now transition to womanhood. And one of the things you highlight then is how it's being viewed, as you're saying that womanhood and the girlhood has also mostly been interrogated around issues of social ills, HIV and AIDS, teenage pregnancy and everything. But everything that is good, or rather that is done culturally, has not been interrogated. And in that aspect then, can you take us through what were your main findings? I want us to jump into your findings because it's something that you really wanted to unpack a lot as we were having a conversation, as to what were your findings into the research as you were going through it.
Okay, so I think that the ritual itself, so one, I don't think that there's enough literature on it. There's enough studies on it. Like, I really think that we can really do more. But what I want the conversation to be about is, I want us to move beyond just writing descriptive narratives when it comes to culture and when it comes to rituals and rites of passage. So for me, it's about uyini umemulo, what does it look like? Yes, of course, that's a big part of the thesis because that's what the thesis is about. But what really the conversation that I want us to have is about the complexities that exist when I interact nomemulo, and then I interact with my family, and then I interact with my society. Like, what are the, like, how can we color that conversation? And also I interact with a post-apartheid rights discourse, where the rights discourse is very clearly about mina, my bodily autonomy, nan. How does that, how do they intersect? So that's the conversation that I am more interested in. I think it's important to note ukuthi umemulo uyini, right? So as you've said, rite of passage that is done for Zulu women, usually done at around 21, and the fundamental thing that the fundamental requirement here is that fanele ukhombise ukuthi ukwazile ukuziphatha kahle. So also, just please let me know if I go into Zulu so that I can translate and still be
okay.
Right, so the understanding is that fanele ukhombise ukuthi ukwazile ukuziphatha kahle. And I think specifically for this presentation, what I'll do is, one, have a conversation about the ways in which this conception of ukuziphatha kahle has shifted. So the ways it's been understood and the ways that it's shifted, and therefore the adaptations that come with that shift to our understanding of umemulo. And then I think the second thing I'll look at specifically is the question of performing girlhood and performing virginity. So those are like two of the major themes out of all of the themes. There are other themes, right? So, such as the utility of umemulo. Why is it useful, right? Whether we speak about it ancestrally or we speak about it, because umemulo, it definitely, absolutely has everything to do with your ancestors, right? So the usefulness ancestrally, the usefulness for people, and there's the idea of the theme of Zulu womanhood that comes out of the findings and our conceptions of Zulu womanhood, which is this understanding of ukuthi umuntu intombi iba umama oqotho. So you grow up and you become umama oqotho. And then the different aspirational kinds of Zulu womanhood that exist. But specifically, I think for this presentation, I'm going to focus on ukuziphatha kahle, the way that we've understood it and how it's shifted and what those shifts are. And then the next thing will be on performing girlhood or performing virginity. So when we speak about ukuziphatha kahle, we're talking about good behavior, right? There are clear distinctions there are two types of ukuziphatha kahle that we speak of in the context of Umemulo. We speak about someone, so the more traditional or the more stricter sense, we speak about somebody who has preserved their virginity. So umuntu ozigcinile, uyitshitshi, uyintombinto. That person has not had sex, right? Then we speak about the second kind of ukuziphatha kahle, which is umuntu who has not had a child, right? So you are 21-year-old who doesn't have a child. You have had sex, right? And so I think maybe also I must say this here is that I interviewed 26 women. Out of the 26 women, of the younger women who I interviewed, majority of them had had umemulo without being virgins, right? So they were subscribing to the concept of ukuziphatha kahle, ukuthi anginangane, they and their families, right? So that was the kind of understanding of ukuziphatha kahle that they were subscribing to. In my study, there are other women who subscribe to the strict sense of ukuziphatha kahle, that fanele nje awukaze nje uthinte umfana kind of thing. And I say this specifically because that's the sort of language that is that the phrases that are used and the kind of framing that is used. So those are the distinctions of ukuziphatha kahle that we have, the two distinctions of ukuziphatha kahle that we have. And then ukuziphatha kahle, so the different women then either endorse one or the other concept of ukuziphatha kahle, right? But more than just your this big obsession with people's virginity, ukuziphatha kahle is also about ukuthi ubaphatha kanjani abantu. So how do you treat other people? How do you treat elders? How do you treat your neighbors? Are you obedient? Are you honest? Are you ukuhlonipha na? Are you respectful to not only your parents and your elders, but to your community as well? So there are also other factors. Those are some of the other factors that show ukuthi uphethe kahle. And so here, what I argue has happened is that our conception of ukuziphatha kahle is shifting. And the reason that I say that is that, one, there have been adaptations made to the process of umemulo based on social political context, right? So, for example, mina elokishini la ngimule khona, we did not go wash in the river on the morning of umemulo. You are meant to go and wash in the river. We didn't do that because the elder women who were helping us with umemulo and the elder women in my family were concerned about safety, right? So they were concerned about will there not be perpetrators and rapists, that kind of thing. That's the kind of safety that we're worried about, because we know the context that we live in South Africa, right? So, and because sometimes the river is just not close by, and so instead of going to the river, we wash like down the street or at the neighbor's house or whatever. So these adaptations are based on the social political context that we find ourselves. But then there are other adaptations or shifts on the concept of ukuziphatha kahle that I think that move away from the obsession with the conversation about whether or not we've had sex, right? And they move towards, so for example, it is now really encouraged as part of ukuziphatha kahle or showing ukuthi ukwazile ukuziphatha kahle. Really have a job, like vusikaya kind of thing. Sorry, I'm hearing some background. Okay. You know, so the shifts of ukuziphatha kahle also now include, or at least our understanding of ukuziphatha kahle also now includes ukuthi uyakwazi yini to be independent, uyakwazi yini ukuthi ufundile yini, uyakwazi yini ukuthi uhlale esikoleni uze uyithole leyo degree le. And this for throughout the interviews with the women, both young and older, because I interviewed 3 categories of women. So young women who had been through the process or were going through the process of Umemulo. The second category was elder women who facilitate Umemulo and virginity testing. But the third category was elder women within the families of the girls who participate in Umemulo. And throughout the interviews and throughout the focus group and the fieldwork, the conversation of education was really being pushed. Ukuthi fundani bantu bami. And part of our understanding of ukuziphatha kahle shifts from this strict uyintombi noma cha, and therefore uzowuthola noma ngeke uthole umemulo, right? So we start to understand ourselves ngendlela ehlukene, right? And so I think that this is part of the conversation around remaking and reimagining umemulo, right? In ways that are useful for the women who participate in it. And I think for me, our ability, so the elder women's ability to shift our conceptions of ukuziphatha kahle is important, because then it allows us to shift the way that we understand umemulo and move away from the more traditional kind of preservation favoring of umemulo. Part of the ways that ukuziphatha kahle, the shifts of ukuziphatha kahle are endorsed by the elder women is that so there's a very interesting thing that happens with this virginity thing, is that even though we're saying we're moving away, it's not an open conversation. Ukuthi thina khona abantu abamula bengewona amantshitshi. And so in fact, I'm pretty sure there are people who probably think I'm just telling family secrets at this point in time. Or rather, you know, part of the thing that happens is that in order to maintain the perception yokuthi uziphathe kahle, even the elder women will, even if they know ukuthi awusili tshitshi, they will say, hi, I'm a tshitshi, right? So they will still have conversations with your family or in the community or whatever to say ukuthi I am a tshitshi, right? To affirm ubutshitshi bakho, even though between you and them niyazi ukuthi that's not the case. And so there's that kind of what we call in the thesis intergenerational collusion is important in the ways for us to understand how these shifts of ukuziphatha kahle happen, right? Or how our understandings and how are remaking umemulo, and in order for it to be useful, because what that allows is that it allows for me to really live my best life sexually, but still maintain ubuntombi bami, my girlhood and my womanhood within my community and within my family and within my society, right? And so I don't think that this is a passive thing that just happens by mistake. I think that the elder women, or rather Zulu women, in conversation between elder and younger, are realizing ukuthi no man, khona izinto ekufanele zinyakaze in order for us to maintain the usefulness of this thing, but ibe useful for Tina and not just for the collective, right? Yeah, and so I think that's part of the shifts. And I also just want to emphasize that even though I think I spent a lot of time in the thesis talking about talking about this thing in the context of democratic South Africa, which I think is important because I think, so the rights discourse is very important. What is namalungelo and amalungelo attached to our bodies as well, right? And so our conceptions of ukuthi siwobani emphakathini also shift because of that. But I don't want to, and I mean, of course, culture is not static. It really is dependent on who are the people who are participating in it. And that gives us the ability to remake it, right? But I want to say that I don't think that this shift or this remaking of Umemulo is just as a result of that political condition. I think that the women within this context have been making the shifts slowly, have been making the shifts even before yabo, democracy, because really understanding Uguti. So I mean, a lot of the elder women, or I think all of them actually that I interviewed, hadn't had Umemulo done for them. Because they had gotten married young, they had had children already, they had, you know, one of the women actually says, yes, abortion was very prevalent, you know. So that experience allows for them to then have a conversation about remaking Umemulo for younger girls, because of the things that they want to achieve ngomemulo, or the standards that they want to set ngomemulo, but also because they understand that by 21, really, most people are having sex. And so we must shift our understandings of so we must shift the implications that sex has on processes like umemulo. I don't know if you want me to go to the next part, or you want to ask some questions, Charity?
There's a person who has a question from our side. Dr. Nolukanyo Metula has joined us, and she has a question. Dr. Nolukanyo, you can go through and ask your question.
Okay, thank you, Lisa. And Ngosi Londingale presentation. I think it is very, very informative, and some of us will gain a lot from your presentation. But I have a question, because I think ideally, Umemulo, I am not a Zulu, I am a Xhosa, but I want to believe that Umemulo, from its conceptualization, was meant to reserve the like ubuntombi bakho. And then now, because of izinto ezenzekayo, as ba ixesha lichinja, people get raped, zinezinto ezenzekayo, and then you end up lose ubuntombi bakho. Is it not unfair that even if you are not a virgin, you are allowed ukuba wenza umemulo, but once you get a child, you cannot? Because I think if you can get raped and then you lose your virginity, that same applies to xa uye wadlwengulwa then ube nomntana. So I think there is some unfairness in the process, because even the women that have children, or a woman that has a child, some of them have been preserving themselves, but because of the unfortunate conditions, they ended up having children. So I think there is something that needs to be done in that regard. Thank you.
Okay, can I go ahead?
Yes, you can, please.
Okay, so I mean, look, Doc, in terms of fairness, I don't know, and So I think that originally, you are right in saying that originally Umemulo was thought of as a way to encourage ukuthi we must preserve ourselves sexually and preserving ubuntombi bakho. So we can, yes, that is the original understanding of why Umemulo exists, but there are other reasons why Umemulo exists, right? So for example, Umemulo, this transition from girlhood to womanhood is about your marriageability, about your social, what's the English word? Ukuthi ubukeka kanjani emphakathini, I don't know what the English is, or at least it's escaping me right now. It's also about an ancestral transition. Ukuthi abantu abadala need to know ukuthi you have moved from a point of ukuba intombi ukuthi ube umama, or rather in this thesis we go on to explore ukuba umama uqotho. And so whether or not the way that the shifts have happened right now has not allowed for women who have children to have umemulo unless it is an ancestral situation. So if you already have a child, but your ancestors really require, as mhlambe when usomdala, and your ancestors really require ukuthi you have umemulo in order to affirm isithunzi sakho, mhlambe khona amabhada khona, whatever ancestral questions that are there, right? That is the only time where umuntu who has a child can have umemulo. And so for me, it's really about thinking about how this ritual can be iyanyakaza kancane kancane to be inclusive. But I also must say that in my experience and in my understanding of Zulu womanhood generally, no one is left behind, right? So ukungabi nomemulo does not, or rather having umemulo does not create this elite group of people. There's not like you can sit here during umsebenzi, but you can't do this and you can't do that, right? So I think that there are other ways that other women who have not gone through the process of umemulo in order to attain their womanhood, particularly Zulu womanhood, there are other ways for us to bring those women onto, bring them through that transition. I have not explored extensively how those other ways work, what they are, but I think that they are there. Because I've never experienced a situation where umemulo, so it's not like with ulwaluko where if awulukanga in a particular way, then siyehla kuba ne category or ne hierarchy ukuthi ukuphi. So that is my understanding and that is my experience. Right? So I'm gonna go into the conversation around performing girlhood or performing virginity, and then I'm hoping that also I will respond to some things as I go through that.
Hi, Lenua. There's a question that has been written on the comment box. So Sis Buyiswa Makubane writes, how do we reconcile Umemulo in 2021 with this idea that females' bodies are policed, unlike that of boys and men, and the emphasis on women needing, ukuziphatha versus men? Are these well-preserved women getting a fair deal when they end up with not so well-preserved men when the promised land of marriage is reached?
Okay, so I will remind me if I forget to flag it, but I will answer it as I go, right? I'm gonna start.
All right, thank you.
performance stuff. So when we speak about performing virginity, performing girlhood, I want us to, or at least for me, our understanding of ukuba intombi in the sense of ukuthi uyichichi, so that you are a virgin, for me, that is or at least in this is a social construct. And I think what the conversation around performing virginity allows us to see is that it allows us to see ukuthi into eperformekayo lena into engikwazi ukuzenza engazathi nginayo, right? Ngibe ngingenayo. Or whether or not I'm and I may not be particularly concerned with that thing, right? So when it comes to performing girlhood and performing virginity, it's here where I start to talk about ukuhlonipha nokufihla, right? So where ukuthi amantombazane ayakwazi so kufanele ahloniphe, right? That's a requirement. Ayahlonipha, but ayakwazi nokufihla. So when we do into that is deemed outside of this realm yokuziphatha kahle, we do it, and this is something that comes through quite clearly in the findings. We do it in the corners, or we do it abazali bethu bengaboni, away from elders, right? And part of ukufihla kwethu, or our ability ukufihla, is part of our ability yokuhlonipha. Sikhombisa ukuthi siyahlonipha ngokufihla kwethu, right? So the concept of ukuhlonipha nokufihla is there are slippages between those concepts, right? And so it's really about how we are perceived. So my performance of ukuziphatha kahle in front of my parents may be top class, but I mean, by 21, I'm at varsity, living my best life, doing whatever I'm doing. And that happens away from my elders, it happens away from my parents. But even in that context, if kuqhamuka umuntu omdala at Rhodes, ngiyabaleka mangenza into that engiyaziyo ukuthi is in the category of ukungaziphathi kahle, right? And it may not be as strict ke. Some people babaleka, abanye ababaleki, but the conversation here is about how we remove ourselves from our elders when we want to do izinto that fall outside of the category of ukuziphatha kahle. And I argue that that is part of performing good girlhood, right? Secondly, I note ukuthi throughout the process of Umemulo, there are different tests that you go through, right? To prove ukuthi uziphethe kahle. One of the tests is to jump over a fire. If you get burned, then uziphethe kahle. If you don't, then uziphethe kahle. The other test, ukuhlaba komkhonto. So mase kwenziwa the actual ceremony, there's a part where your uncle or your brothers give you umkhonto, and you must throw this spear and into the ground. It must stand. If it doesn't stand, it's not good. Awuziphethe kahle. But if it stands, uziphethe kahle, right? So, and then there's the cow fat, umhlwehlwe, that we wear. If that thing tears, awuziphethe kahle, it must remain intact. From my conversations with the women that I spoke to, they didn't think that there were real links between ukuziphatha kahle kwabo and these tests, right? Because if you jump high enough, you won't get burnt. If you hlaba the spear where the ground is hard, it's gonna fall. Isn't this ganjalo? So it didn't seem to me that the women that I spoke to thought that there was this clear link between ukuziphatha kwabo and these tests. But what they did do is perform these tests and perform them successfully, because the perception of being a good girl or to have performed good behavior is important in solidifying and holding the process together. And so even then, it is not just the younger women who are, so it is the younger women who are performing, yes, but the older women are also in conversation with this performance. One of the younger women even said, ugogo owayemsiza ukuthi enze umemulo wakhe was like, hey, shaya la umkhonto, I watered it, kind of thing. So the ground is soft, shaya la umkhonto, so that umkhonto wakho uzoma. So there's an understanding that the tests really are about performance and are about perception. And so here, it's important to understand that the way that in the thesis, I call it the Zulu world sense, borrowing from Oyewumi, when she thinks about the African world sense, is that there's a collective, we experience the world as a collective, whether it's metaphysical or physical, right? And so when the tests are performed but not successfully, there's a thing that happens to the perception of the collective. It's not just about ulundi, right? It's about my family, it's about my parents, it's about abantu basendaweni esigodini sangakithi ukuthi hawu intombi asekho lapha, right? So there's a collective reason as to why the perception, or rather the performance must happen the way that it happens. And then, so part of this collective experience and me performing my girlhood and my good girlhood rather successfully is because fanele sivike ihlazo, right? So my understanding and the elder women's understanding, so whether it is my mother, my gran, and whether it is the woman who helps with facilitating Umemulo, is that the performance and the successful performance, therefore, of good behavior and of good girlhood is about lokuvika kwehlazo nokuvikeleka kwesithunzi sami nesithunzi somndeni wami. So it's about the collective implication, right? And so that's where this idea of performance it comes on. So first, it's this idea, the slippages between ukuhlonipha and ukufihla, but secondly, it's this active performance of ukuziphatha kahle, right? And so when Uvui talks about women who are women's bodies being policed unlike boys, I think interestingly in the study, the elder women really emphasize this thing yokuthi ingane kufanele ikhuliswe ngendlela efanayo. It is no longer sustainable ukukhulisa amantombazane ngendlela eyodwa ukhulise abafana ngendlela engafani, right? It is no longer useful. And so they really emphasized that. And whether or not, you know, these women are not getting the better end of the deal in this promise of marriage and marriageability because we're not raising boys the same way, I think that's a question about our socialization, nokuthi sikhulisana kanjani, right? And that sorry, I'm just making sure that I'm getting the question properly as well. So are these well-preserved women getting a fair deal when they end up with not so well-preserved men when they're in the promised land of marriage? I think these women, at least according to the study, are not well-preserved, and I don't women are still able to have sexual freedom and do whatever they want, so long as, at least in this context and in the context of this paper, so long as you are not seen ukuthi you are having sex. And the thing ekwenza ube seen ukuthi you are having sex, ukuba nomntwana, right? That in fact tells us that you are having sex. And so I honestly, we don't think that, you know, there's the majority is in the preservation camp. And based on my data and my findings, the majority is not in the preservation camp. And those who are in the preservation camp have very interesting ideas around marriage and about the other camp, which I don't think I spent enough time exploring in the thesis, but I think it's very interesting the ways the women who do have these traditional understandings of ukuziphatha kahle. It is very interesting the way that they then think about sex and they think about marriage. Often they experience these conversations through punitive ways. Ukuthi ungalingi uyenze leyo nto, right? And that's, for me, it's just not healthy. Yeah, so I'll stop there. I think there's a question. Can you please just...
Okay. This is from, I think it's Dr. Spogazi. I think it's a doctor, yes. Goglondi, with the point you make about the difference between Umemulo and Ulaluko, for example, is important. A Xhosa man who does not go through initiation, while a woman, okay, a Xhosa man who does not go through initiation may always be considered to be a boy, inkwenkwe, while a woman who does not go through Umemulo can still become umfazi or umama. So can one still become umama or god without having Umemulo?
Thanks, Doc, for the question. I think that they can. So based on my experience and my engagement with this work, I think that they can. And I think that the conception yokuba umama oqotho, because so in the paper I make the move between intombi to umama oqotho, because that is how the Zulu women described womanhood, how they understood womanhood. I think it is possible because, again, I think that our requirements for womanhood, or rather ukuba umama oqotho, are constantly shifting, right? So awumulanga but you're married, right? Because marriage is a big deal in our social structures. Awumulanga but you're married. Awumulanga, you're married, uvuse ikhaya la kwaSibanibani at your husband's place or whatever. Those are different conceptions of ukuba umama uqotho, right? Awumulanga, you have a child, but you've managed to give, but you have, you are of a particular class, you've managed to get an education, get a, like, economic mobility. You've got that economic mobility within your family, and you've managed to give your children, get them into good schools and make sure iy'ngane zakho ziyafundiseka and ziyaphila, you know, in this world. So I think there are different ways of moving from ukuba intombi to being, or rather from moving from girlhood to womanhood in this context. I do not think that Umemulo is the only way or the only avenue with which to get to that level yokuba umama uqotho. I think there are particular things about Umemulo that that Zulu women have wanted to preserve because of the kind of women that it then creates. So it creates this umamuqotho. So things like the rules for seclusion before umemulo wakho, ukuthi like you can't be loud, you can't be seen, you are particularly respectful. When you go outside, uyazimboza. Part of that is because of the way that we think about ukuthi umuntu mayeseshadile noma umuntu mayesewumama or umfazi kufanele abe njani, because the idea is that we make these rules and these standards uzilandele khona uzozilandela noma you've transitioned, right? You will, those standards and those rules will remain for you, and we would have created that particular kind of woman, right? Umama ozothayo, umama okwazi ukukhuluma nabantu abadala, umama ohloniphayo, umama ongangcoli, kind of thing. And I think that those are specific conceptions that we have about what women should be, and that those conceptions are built as a society, as a people. But really, you can still be all those things and not having gone through Umemulo. I also think one of the really important things maybe to mention from the findings about ukuba umamuqotho, and in the discussion about ukuba umamuqotho, is this idea yokuthi umamuqotho wenza izinto zenzeke, right? So mhlamba umulanga, mhlamba unengane, you know, but uyakwazi ukwenza izinto zenzeke. And I found that concept very interesting, because it goes into this this kind of the thing that we know to be true, right? Ukuthi mama are the ones really who make things happen and who hold our societies together in ways that as is nagi, or they are not part of the mainstream of our understanding of ukwenza izinto zenzeke, but that is part of being umamuqotho. And so your ability to do that, and Dr. Ntabiseng Mutseme calls it, or rather conceptualizes upanda in this way, right? So where the economic and the political context requires us ukuthi sipande and make things happen, in order ukuthi ingane zihambe esikoleni, in order ukuthi, you know, impilo iqhubeke sustainably. And so I think that for me, maybe that is one of the key, I don't know what to call it, key pillars of ukuba umamuqotho, is this idea of making things happen. Ukuthi noma kunjani ngizozenza izinto zenzeke. And I think we can problematize that in different ways, but I found it interesting that that's how the women themselves defined ukuba umamuqotho. So yes, we are hlonipha, yes, you engage the neighbors, yes, you are all these things that are prescribed, but ultimately into kufanele uyenze ukwenza sure ukuthi la ekhaya kuyaphileka. So I'm happy to take more questions, and then maybe
okay, before we,
yeah,
okay, you can go on, you can finish your sentence.
No, I just was saying I'm happy to take more questions and then maybe speak through some of future research that could come from this project. Yeah.
Okay. The last question we have is from Dr. Metula, and she asked, Gogo, do you think girls are aware of how inclusive Umemulo is, or they still think that they can't go through Umemulo once they become sexually active, regardless of ukuziphatha kahle, they can't perform the ritual?
So the question is, are the girls aware that it's become inclusive?
Yes, and or are they still having the perception that if they become sexually active, then they can't go through umemulo?
I think the perception exists for a while, that you have the perception yokuthi hayi mhlambe if ngenza kanjena ngeke ngize ngimule. But that's part of the punitive nature of the way of that's part of the punitive side of our thinking about sex and women, right? So that perception, I think, exists for a while. I do not think that perception exists until 21. I think also because younger girls are able to participate in Umemulo wami, for example. So they're able to join Umemulo wami. And so they are part of the conversations that are happening, that are shifting this and rethinking Umemulo and the ideas of ukuziphatha kahle. Yeah, so I think that the perception that you can't falls away quite quickly. And if you are engaging in spaces with other girls and other women, it's likely that you will know. And that's part of the open secretness of this whole thing, right? Is that siyayixoxa but imfihlo. Do you understand? So I think that by the time you would be offered to do umemulo, because you don't decide for yourself to do umemulo, your parents offer you, okay, sizokwenzela umemulo. By the time you are being offered umemulo, you really have an understanding of how inclusive, or how much it, at least the gatekeepers have shifted our understandings of ukuziphatha kahle. But I also think that because our access to sexual reproductive rights has, like, you know, is now a thing in post-apartheid, or rather in democratic South Africa, is that I have access to a contraceptive. And so ngizoziphilela ngendlela engiphila ngayo and decide what I participate in, and no one will be people will be none the wiser, or elders rather will be none the wiser. So I think that perception shifts quite quickly. You're frozen on my side, Isa.
Oh, hi, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. Something that just came into mind as you were unpacking the last part, that it is the parents that choose to do umemulo, not the girl. Don't you think there have been instances where parents have decided to do umemulo for their girl, even though engakhanga aziphathe kahle, in order to keep the dignity of the family? As you're explaining, ukuziphatha kahle, it does not only is not only reduced to me not having a child, but to many other things, my behavior within isigodi, my behavior within the family and the community as large. It hasn't been there such a situation where, even though parents can see that your behavior is not the one that is standardized of what is regarded as ukuziphatha kahle, have still went on and did umemulo?
Sure, interesting. I think in this study specifically, it was very clear to me that a lot of us are siziphethe kahle, but abazali don't know. They have the perception that siziphethe kahle because of the ways that we choose to behave phambi kwabo. So in one of the
Yeah.
groups, the younger women were really debating amongst each other what ukuziphatha kahle entailed in terms of so if ngizigcinile, but I go out, I drink, ngiyeqa ebusuku ekhaya, angilawuleki ekhaya, but ngizigcinile. The other example was angizigcinanga, but ngiyahlonipha ekhaya, ngenza yonke into ekhaya, ngiyabahlonipha abantu abadala. So I'm ticking all the boxes in terms of good behavior. And so I thought that was an interesting debate. It was happening in a group Umemulo together. So Umemulo wabo that I was attending. And that, because of that debate and because of the different understandings of ukuziphatha kahle in that group, they didn't find, because one of the questions I asked is whether or not they would do Umemulo for their children, whether they find it useful. They didn't find it useful. For them, it was really an exercise for their parents. It was about the perception of their parents, it was about it was about an ancestral process. For them, it did not have any particular implications, their girlhood or their womanhood. It didn't have any particular implications for their sexualities. They continued to live their lives as they lived their lives. And they didn't understand what's the use, you know? So I found in that focus group, I found that kind of push and pull and that kind of debate quite interesting. And so I don't know, I suppose, and I think one of the elder women at some point makes the observation that Umemulo is really now about showing off, and like it must be this big event, and whatever, and that is really about the parents. It's not about ingane. Whereas really Umemulo is about ingane that are transitioning into adults, nokuthi amadlozi akwazi ukuthi affirm isithunzi sabo as bekhula, and affirm isithunzi ekhaya based on ukuthi bona baziphathe kahle. And so women really still carry that burden nokuthi yimi ophethe isithunzi sasekhaya kind of thing. But really what the process is supposed to be about, ukuthi sithi si affirma isithunzi sakho, si affirme nesithunzi somndeni wakho, and then as an announcement for your marriageability. But nowadays, you know, class plays a huge role in the ways that we do and experience Umemulo as well.
Thank you. On the part where you mentioned that it is about, most of the time, as it now, parents kind of showing off. It reminds me of a time when I was still at Forte. There was a year, I think it was 2016, where I saw a trend of young girls getting pregnant in order to have the best baby shower. It was a shocking thing that everyone was competing to have the baby shower at ICC or have it in some, but it was a thing of, where did you have your baby shower? And now it reminds me, what you're talking about, it reminds me of who had the best Umemulo in terms of esgodini, and now it become more materialistic than being about what really it is about in the traditional way of, we are now telling the ancestors that you are now transitioning to be a woman. So it becomes more materialistic. But I'm gonna take one last question before you move to your recommendations of, because you speak on your research about the variations in terms of ukuziphatha. Awonke has a question for you and he has raised his hand. I'm going to allow you, Awonke, to pose your question to Gokulondiwe, and yeah, you may have the floor.
Thank you, Isa. It's really not a question, just a comment on your presentation, Ms. Ndambo. Thank you very much for a lovely presentation, and thank you for taking research kule matter. NdingumXhosa ke mna, so izinto zakwaZulu andizazi that much. I'm just puzzled by the method that is being used to assess ukuziphatha kakuhle, like okwakutsiba umlilo and ukuthrowa ispear such that yatshona emhlabeni or it does not. I'm just puzzled by that method. I don't see the correlation between ukuziphatha kahle and ukutsha nokungatshi xa utsiba emlilweni, or a correlation between ukuziphatha kakuhle and ukutshona nokungatshoni kwespear emhlabeni. I feel like the question of ukuziphatha kakuhle, it's an important question, but the method that is being taken to assess that question, to find an answer for that question, the method itself is not realistic. It has a high possibility of producing results that are not correct. Then the question might be this: why do you then, like, as abantu bakwaZulu, stick to the same method over and over and over, whereas somehow it has a high possibility of not producing results that are realistic?
Can I go ahead, Isa?
Yes, you can.
Well, it's because it's not about realistic results. Or rather, it is not about realistic, it's about perceptions. And the idea here is that as umuntu wesifazane, you are not supposed to be known or to be seen as umuntu ongaziphethe kahle. Whether that is the reality or it is not the reality, the thing that is required for Umemulo is that you must have shown ukuthi uziphethe kahle. And that's not to say that abantu abaziphethe kahle and they just perform these things and you know, that's that. But it's to say that the ways that we think about ukuziphatha kahle as a requirement for Umemulo is about performance. And I think that that says something really important about the ways that we've thought about virginity in let's call it Western kinds of thinking, where it's this biological thing, or, you know. And I think what this conversation around the performance of good girlhood and the performance of virginity, I think it allows us to dispute that. It allows us to have a conversation, which I think feminists have been having for a while, about the social construct of this thing. And the performance for me, at least in this, the usefulness of the performance for me is for the women. I'm not too concerned about so I'm really concerned with what women themselves, how they are able to use this performance and this social construction in order to attain particular things that give them benefits within their societies. And I think that that's something that women, or Zulu women in this context, are actively able to do. And if you look at it, lens, this is just a passive thing, an oppression thing, or because it happens also in a patriarchal context. But what are the women able to do, and what usefulness are the women themselves able to find from this performance and this perception. And yeah, so I think that's the thing, the more important question for me.
Okay, thank you, Lonju. As you go through to your recommendation, I'm not sure if you were going to touch on this, but as I was reading your thesis, there was a part where I found interesting, and I wanted to ask a question on that. So I'm asking it so that if you don't touch on it, you can touch on it, then go to your recommendations. So you say on your thesis, as part of the process of Umemulo, they use songs and everything to as part of the traditional process. And you then say some of on the songs of appreciation and thankfulness, the emphasis is placed on the father, because the Umemulo is the gift of the father, and the emphasis on the girl's father can also be seen in the rhetoric of ukugcina, isibaya, sikaBaba, which translate to having preserved yourself and therefore your father's crop. Now, my question was in my mind, isn't this problematic that the emphasis is on the father when it has been women who have helped the girl uphold the good behavior? And this was coming in my mind as I think a few days ago, Chimamanda had posted a post about her marriage when she was going through her wedding, and she says instead of having her father walking her down the aisle, she had both of her parents walking her down the aisle. And instead of having the first dance with her father, she rather had it with her mother, because she felt that her mother was actually the one person who was behind all who she is and everything that has allowed her to be where she is today, getting married. And she felt that it was problematic that now all of a sudden everything translates to being his father's position. In a lack of a better word, he's the one who's been glorified.
I don't, so I think that the process itself is very much a women-centered process and a women-led process. The idea behind ukuthi ubaba umuntu okwenzela umemulo is similar, or because umemulo was initially about announcing your marriageability, it was about the conversation when it comes to my marriageability in the Zulu culture is not going to happen between women in my family and men in my potential family, right? It's going to happen between amadoda. And for me, it's not, I don't want to say it's about glorifying the man and not being thankful towards your mother, because I think the entire process really, there's such an engagement with elder women in the process, that elder women clearly lead the situation, or rather that women generally clearly lead the situation. And I think we all have an understanding of that. It is just the way that the songs are structured, I think, are just because of the ways that our societies have been structured through patriarchal lenses, is that kuzotiwa ubaba uthangimuli, because ubaba who comes to me and says na inkomo yakho yokumula, right? It's just the way that it's done. I think we can. So I mean, now just moving into future research as well. I didn't phrase it as recommendations as such because, you know, I find that a little bit tense. But in terms of thinking more about this thing. So I think that the paper or the thesis, unfortunately, or as a result of context, really, is very heteronormative, right? So I am speaking to women who are going to marry men, you know, And I don't think that is necessarily a fact. I just think that because of the ways that girlhood and womanhood has been framed in relation to Umemulo, that's what we're thinking about. We are thinking in these heteronormative ways, and we're thinking in these gender binaries. And so I think that part of the thing to explore is really around one, heteronormativity. I hope I said that properly, but the heteronormative ways in which we think about women's sexuality, marriageability, and all that kind of thing. And then to think about so with your question, the patriarchal things that we reinforce in doing the process the way that we do it, right? And in insisting on holding on to particular things that are not necessarily true. So I know, for example, in my memulo, and I think another memulo that was part of the study, the girls transitioning into women, so the younger women made sure to sing when made sure to shift between the mom and the dad. You know, I think people are participating in these things, and so it can't be that we think that these things are static. So people choose to participate in them in useful ways for isikhathi samanje, as Uvi was asking earlier on. 2021, it's in usefulness. And then the other thing that I think is something that I need to think about more, and that other scholars can, you know, most certainly think about, is this idea of no one is left behind when it comes to Zulu womanhood. So what are the ways? So when the question Doc was asking earlier on, what are the other ways that we can attain good womanhood, or we can become, oh, Mama Bakoto, that isn't this thing of going through Umemulo? I think that that's something that we really need to explore, particularly if we think that Ukuba Umama Uqotho is an important concept. And I think it's an important concept, but it's also an interesting one because it shifts in indlela understanding ngayo. It's constantly shifting. And you know, if you're a woman who's going to work, usazobuya endlini upheke, ubuya ngo-9, you're like some top in your company, it doesn't make sense. It is no longer sustainable to think about ukuba umama uqotho in those rigid ways. And so it's shifting because of who is participating in ukuba umama uqotho. And lastly then, which I guess is a question that you know, it nicely leads from the last thing that I just said, is who gets to remake these rituals? Straight, or rather cis heterosexual women can remake these processes. Do other people have the same ability to remake these rituals in useful ways for themselves? Because we're saying that this category of women that we've interviewed are remaking it in useful ways for bona and for context abagiona. Who else is able to do this? And again, I think that goes back to the conversation about patriarchy and how we think about the ways that we structured our lives and how we are socialized from girlhood into womanhood. I am not sure that it is the case that a lesbian woman would be able to remake Umemulo. I'm not sure that it is the case that a trans woman would be able to remake Umemulo in this way, in this inclusive way that we've argued for here. And so it's something that I really think needs to be explored. And if we really want to say that our conceptions of womanhood are inclusive, for abanye abantu who are not cis women, who are not cis heterosexual women. Yeah, so those are some of the conversations that I think can be explored a little bit further post this research. I think one of the things, maybe just as a personal note, one of the things that I really want to explore more in general and not just in the conversation of Umemulo is this concept of the Zulu world sense and how we interact between ourselves and our ancestors. And of course has a lot to do with ubungoma bami. And so that's really something that I personally think I want to explore, about the metaphysics of the way esiphila ngakhona, you know, how do these things intersect? Where do they meet? You know, yeah. So I'll stop there.
Okay. From Facebook side, we have a comment. Can you hear me, Lund?
Mm-hmm.
So from Facebook side, someone was reiterating what Awenga was talking about. That so you were saying it's Loiso, and he's saying wonderful information, but the method of throwing the spear to check if uziphethe kakuhle or you are not is not trusted. And I think it spoke on what you were mentioning, that even women who are performing this ritual have a similar understanding of saying, as you're saying that umama will say, ngigalele amanzi lana, so umkhonto wakho uzoma. It's the understanding that it can't really be that when there's drought that it's gonna stand because the soil is hard. And Yolokazi Mfuto then has a question, which is, I think it's similar to what Awongo was talking about. Is the method of using the spear, umhlehlo, and skipping fire, is it not a superstition because superstition belief, since it's highly associated with introduction to ancestors? Remember, we are unable to explain everything through thoroughly using English and sometimes even the contemporary lenses.
Yeah, so I mean, I completely agree with Yolo that phela lezinto is not just about it's not about this world, you know, it's not about things that we can always explain and the touch and feel. I don't think that the kinds of tests, so uguti, it's the fire, it's the spear, I don't think that the kinds of tests are important. I think what's important is that the tests are there. So, right, there could be other tests still have no correlation with ukuziphatha kahle kwakho, ukuziphatha kahle kwakho, no, and the successful performance of the test. The thing here is that our ability to perform good girlhood and our ability to perform virginity in the ways that we've outlined in this presentation challenge the understanding of not just Western societies, but our own societies, the understandings that we have about virginity and the importance and the emphasis that we place on isibaya sikaBaba or kugcina isibaya sikaBaba, that kind of thing. So there's a challenge here in the ways that we think about ukuba intombi nto. Yeah.
Without keeping you and the rest of the audience any further, I'm gonna take one last question from Dr. Metula, because I think Bongeziwe says, I wanted to ask, Umemulo is done for virgins, right? What happens when on the day of the ceremony do you get tested, which is you've already answered. So I'm gonna go to Dr. Metula and then I'm gonna do a close up of the session. Dr. Metula, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you, Isa. It is not a question, but rather a comment. Kulenda by a method. I believe that Umemulo, from its conceptualization, was about keeping a tradition. And a method eyayisetyenziswa ngoko was a traditional way, which is the same method esesetyenziswayo nangoku. And because ababantu basaqhubekayo bawenzayo umemulo still have those traditional beliefs that if you do this, if utsibe emlilweni maybe watsha, that means awuziphethanga kakuhle. So as long umemulo usenziwa, a method cannot change because it is an African way of ukwenza izinto. We cannot expect to do izinto as traditional and then use a scientific method. That is not how it goes. So even if I second valid ngohlobo esizibona ngalo thina izinto now, but it is the method of ukwenza the ritual. So it cannot change. We cannot use the scientific method. And now I'll go to the comment that I've just posted. It seems as if umemulo is no longer the real mumulo. There's no reality. Umemulo now, it's just a representation of the ritual. There is a lot of imitation because going to bakutwe now phose phayana ndiza kugalela amanzi kwenza ukuthi xa uphosile uhlale umkhonto. That means awusenanyani ngoku, yabo. There is a lot of imitation. It's just a representation. So I think it goes back to just the consequences of ukwenza umemulo okanye what a woman gain from ukwenza umemulo, even if akasaziphethanga kakuhle or akasazipreservanga yena as a woman, but just to gain that recognition of ukuba uziphethe kakuhle. Thank you.
Okay,
over to you.
Thanks. I think in closing, I'll try and respond to the questions and then just give my closing remarks. I do not think that adaptations or changes to a ritual equate to it no longer being the ritual, right? So I don't think that umemulo is no longer the real memulo. In the same way that, for example, with ulwaluko, alisenziwa exactly the same way elalenziwa 30 years ago. There have been some interventions from the state, for example. There's interventions, or rather at least an interaction between abantu who practice the ritual and who facilitate the ritual and hospitals, because we understood parts of the way that we are doing this, or we're doing this ritual, is unsafe. And so how do we make it safer? That doesn't mean that ulwaluko is no longer ulwaluko. So I don't think that because umemulo is being done in a different way, that, or at least that there are shifts and there are adaptations, that it's no longer the real thing. Of course, it remains the real thing, because the links to your ancestors, the links to your family, the links to your collective group as women still exist. And those implications are still real for the people who choose to participate in the process of umemulo, right? So the argument around performance is not to say uthi siyenza nje. No, the argument around performance is about the underlying thing that allows us to continue to use umemulo ngendlela that makes sense in 2021 or in 2020, or when the study was happening, right? So yeah, so I think that's an important point to make. The question around whether or not you get tested, so for the people who value, or rather who think through ukuziphatha kahle through the lens of preservation, virginity testing is part of the process of umemulo for them. For those of us who go in the route of ukungabi nangane, in thinking about ukuziphatha kahle is one of those fundamental things. You don't do that. You do the other tests. So both groups though will do the other tests. Both groups bazohlaba umkhonto, both groups bazofaka umhlwehlwe, both groups bazokweqa umlilo, right? So those are the distinctions. The interesting thing for me here is that I don't think that these adaptations are new, right? Like as in into esiyenzeka manje because of modern day societies. I don't think that and this is clear in the way that the findings are set up as well. I don't think that the elder generation was preserving themselves until 21. This is clear because none of the women in the elder women's what is it? Isample yami. None of them had umemulo because they had children or they had been married. They had been pregnant and had abortions. So people are not really, or women are not really adhering to this rule. So I don't think because of this modern times and these shifts. I think that these shifts have been happening but because we are so preoccupied when we write about umemulo, we are preoccupied about the aesthetics of gita, maculo. We are preoccupied by the process. So a lot of the literature I read was really about the process. We haven't asked the questions around sex and sexuality. We haven't asked the questions around how people think about ukuziphatha kahle. And now that we're asking those questions, like I really think that the agency of Zulu women and their ability to shift these things has been going on for a while. And I do think, of course, that access to reproductive health, access to our bodily rights and the way that we think about ourselves, shifts that again. So, but you are exposing the family secrets. And so those shifts have been happening, right? And so just to close off, I really hope that this thesis is able to open up broader conversations about Zulu girlhood and about Zulu womanhood, and generally about the ways about African womanhood and about African girlhood, ways that move us away from just thinking about girlhood through precarity or womanhood through precarity. I really think that that's, for me, now that's important. I also think that, or at least I hope that this thesis is able to move us away from a conversation that puts culture against rights, like as if you cannot participate usefully in your culture and in your rituals and your rites of passage and still have and still hold your human rights and still have access to your human rights. Yeah, I think fanele sihlanganise sibone ukuthi kwenzakalani, because here we are in 2021 modern day times, but we are still Zulu, we are still whatever different cultural group we come from, and some of us still choose to perform or rather to participate in these cultural rituals because there is a usefulness there, there's a utility there. So I'd rather then we unpack ukuthi ithini utility, sekushifte kanjani, sizokusebenzisa kanjani manje, instead of the, oh, this is how it is supposed to happen and this is what it's supposed to look like. The reality is that it doesn't happen that way and it doesn't look that way. So ithini into, like, what's the conversation? Yeah, and I think I went there. I hope, you know, I've done a fair job at this presentation and responding to your questions. Thank you so much, everyone, for staying and for continuing to engage with me. Thank you so much. I really, really appreciate it. And thank you, Isa, for the platform.
Thank you, Londi. To show that you have done your justice into your presentation, Zimasa on Facebook says, learn so much from today's discussion, attending my friend's Umemulo in a few weeks with a better understanding of everything. Congratulations on your research, Mdase. So you've done your part and you've done it well. And as we're about to start this conversation, one of the things that I had in mind that was going to be a plea to you and many other scholars that are writing on this is to actually write and compile a book on these different cultures and how they're done. And I've said this the last time I was in conversation with Bizo Pomela, and as he was studying the traditional spiritual role of Xhosa women in the contemporary South Africa. And most of what he highlighted was about Odadobawo. I don't know what you call it in KwaZulu. And I was saying to him, I am a Dadobawo, but I don't have any information on what you're talking about. Because of urbanization, migration, and everything else, there's been a loss of transferring of that information from ugogo to uma to mina, because we no longer live in one place and we no longer having those situations whereby Siema Simini and then they start narrating what happens. Now everyone is just living separately. And I'm worried about the generation to come, which is the generation after us, who would depend on us to have this information, and even ourselves don't necessarily have this information. So it's really a plea for all of us to gather our heads together in writing these books and just explaining these traditions, because like you say, they play a significant role. There are traditions that I didn't know that I necessarily needed to do until I was later on in my life, and in my family they had not been done for a very long time, and all of a sudden ancestors wanted me to do them. And the question is, how do we move when it comes to this, because it has not been done for so long. And I think it's about time, as we have been saying, that we document these traditions. And I like how in your thesis on the introduction, you write even the songs, you write everything in process. Anyone who reads that, who's Zulu and was never having a privilege of having a grandmother or a mother to translate that, they at least would have an idea of what it means to have Umemulo and how it goes about. And hopefully that one day, these are the things that could be taught at school to children to understand who they are, their culture, their identity, and everything. Because I share the same sentiments as you, that these things are important, regardless of the world evolving. They play a significant role in our lives as African people. And there are people who believe them believe in them and should not be excluded in the conversation because the rest of other people want to move to a different direction. So thank you very much for this conversation. I appreciate the time you gave us here at Young Researchers Hub and giving us a moment to listen to you and tap into your research and doing exactly what I planned this platform for, is to allow science and the public community to merge. There were a couple of Xhosa people who were here, and I'm sure they've learned so much about what it means to be Zulu, the Zulu womanhood, and we could see we're not really far apart from each other. What it means to ukuziphatha kahle in your home, as much as I'm Xhosa, it almost means the same thing. Yeah. So if I was to be raised in your family, I'll still be taught the same principles that my parents would have taught me. And I'm sure it's the same for Sotho. I'm sure it's the same for people in East Africa and West Africa, because these are principles that are ingrained in our Africanness. And I believe that we need to document this principle for this current generation and generation to come. And with that, I'm closing the session, and I thank everyone who took their time and listened to this conversation. I understand that it didn't get limited on that hour. And again, that's the beauty of why I had Young Researchers Hub. I wanted to create a platform where people are not limited in unpacking their research, so that we don't rush the conversation and end up leaving things. So sometimes the conversation will take an hour and sometimes will take more. And I continuously appreciate your time that you invest in listening to us as we have the conversation. And for next week, we're not going to have the session. The next session, we're going to have it on the 18th, if it's not the 19th. That's on a Friday, and we'll be having an interesting conversation. It's on the 18th on Friday. We'll be having an interesting conversation with Esethu Njenjani on Fees Must Fall and the participation of women, as he interrogates their participation during Fees Must Fall. And I feel it's a very interesting conversation, seeing that we are on June 16. And we again continue to converse about the role of women in our society as a whole. From us, the Young Researchers Hub, we thank you for your time. Our country is on third wave, as we have been alerted. Please continue to sanitize, continue to wear your mask, social distance, make sure that your family is safe, you safe, and everyone that you love, in order to beat this pandemic. And from us, have a great weekend and have a great week as we start the week next week. Goodbye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Londi.